Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Okay, Reddit. I'm finally ready to share what happened in Asheville, Kentucky during the mid-80s. I was 12 years old in 1982. Living with my mom, Beverly, and stepdad, Thomas, in this sleepy coal mining town where nothing ever happened. Thomas worked the night shift at Blackwood Mine, coming home covered in coal dust every morning, while Mom ran the local post office, a job that made her the unofficial town gossip hub. Our house sat on Maple Street, third one from the corner, with a wraparound porch where I'd spend hours reading comic books and watching neighbors tend their gardens. Asheville had maybe 800 people, the kind of place where everyone attended the same church, shopped at the same grocery store, and knew which family had money troubles just by observing who bought generic cereal. Life moved at a snail's pace, and honestly, I thought I'd die of boredom before I ever made it to high school. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning in March when Mrs. Hoffman from down the street came running into the post office, waving a white envelope like it was on fire. I was there helping Mom sort mail before school, and I remember how Mrs. Hoffman's usually perfect hair looked wild, her face flushed red from running. She slammed the letter on the counter and demanded to know who had access to the mail, her voice shaking with rage. The envelope had her name written in neat block letters, no return address, and inside was a single sheet of paper that apparently contained information about her husband's gambling debts that had supposedly been wiped clean years ago. What made it worse was that the letter mentioned specific amounts, dates, and even the name of the bookie in Louisville. Mrs. Hoffman swore only 3 people knew those details: herself, her husband, and the bookie. The problem was her husband had been dead for 2 years, and the bookie had moved to Florida. Mom tried to calm her down, but Mrs. Hoffman just kept repeating that someone was watching them all, someone who knew things they shouldn't know. Within a week, 3 more families received similar letters. The Hendersons got one detailing how their teenage son Kyle had been stealing from the church collection plate for months, complete with exact amounts and dates. The Johnsons received a letter about how Mrs. Johnson had been having an affair with the married pharmacist 2 towns over, including details about a specific birthmark on the man's shoulder that only someone who'd seen him undressed would know. But the letter that really sent shockwaves through our community was the one delivered to the Presleys. Their envelope contained information about how Mr. Presley had been skimming money from the volunteer fire department's emergency fund to pay for his daughter's medical treatments. The letter included photocopies of bank statements, forged signatures, and a breakdown of exactly how he'd been moving money around. What terrified everyone was the level of detail. These weren't just rumors or gossip. These were facts that required intimate knowledge of people's private lives, financial records, and personal relationships. The town started to unravel fast. People who had been friends for decades suddenly became suspicious of each other. Mrs. Henderson accused the church secretary of writing the letters since she had access to the collection records. The Johnsons blamed the pharmacist's wife, thinking she'd discovered the affair and was seeking revenge. But the scariest part was how accurate every single detail was. When confronted, Kyle Henderson broke down and confessed to stealing from the church. Mrs. Johnson didn't deny the affair, but swore she'd never told anyone about the birthmark. Mr. Presley eventually admitted to the embezzlement, but insisted he'd covered his tracks so well that even the bank auditors hadn't noticed. The letters weren't just exposing secrets, they were revealing truths that people thought they'd buried forever. Thomas started coming home from work early, checking all our windows and doors before bed. Mom stopped gossiping with customers at the post office, afraid that anything she said might somehow end up in one of those white envelopes. The letters kept coming, always on different days of the week, always hand-delivered to mailboxes during the night. Nobody ever saw who delivered them, despite half the town taking turns keeping watch. Old Mr. Bailey set up a chair by his front window and stayed awake 3 nights straight, but even he never caught sight of the mysterious letter writer. The envelopes were always identical, plain white paper, no watermark, with names written in the same careful block letters using a standard blue ballpoint pen. The police chief, Ed McQuaid, collected several of the letters for analysis. But this was 1982 in rural Kentucky. We didn't have access to sophisticated forensic testing. The only thing he could confirm was that the handwriting appeared to be deliberately disguised, with the writer probably using their non-dominant hand to avoid recognition. What made it even more unsettling was that the letters seemed to target specific people for specific reasons. The recipients weren't random. They were all people who held positions of trust or respect in the community, people whose secrets would cause the most damage when exposed. By summer, the situation had escalated beyond simple gossip and shame. The Riverside family received a letter detailing how their supposedly deceased grandfather had actually abandoned the family 30 years earlier after stealing their neighbor's life savings. The letter included a current address in Oregon, where the grandfather was supposedly living under a false name, along with photos of him working at a hardware store. When the family confronted the neighbor, Mrs. Yates, she broke down crying and admitted she'd never told anyone about the theft because she'd been too ashamed to admit she'd trusted someone with her late husband's insurance money. The revelation destroyed the friendship between the families and split the entire neighborhood into sides. Then came the letter that changed everything. The Nelsons received an envelope containing evidence that their 15-year-old daughter, Chloe, had been secretly dating a married man in his 30s from the next county over. The letter included motel receipts, photographs of them together, and detailed descriptions of their meetings. It was the kind of information that could only come from someone who had been following them, watching them, documenting their every move. Mr. Nelson went into a rage unlike anything I'd ever witnessed. He was a quiet man who worked as a mechanic at the local garage, but when he read that letter, he became someone else entirely. He grabbed his shotgun from the gun cabinet and drove straight to the man's house, demanding justice for what he considered the abuse of his daughter. The confrontation ended with Mr. Nelson shooting the man in the leg before neighbors managed to wrestle the gun away from him. The whole incident could have been much worse, but it marked the point where the letters stopped being just a source of embarrassment and became genuinely dangerous. Mr. Nelson was arrested, the injured man was hospitalized, and Chloe was so traumatized by the exposure and violence that she attempted to hurt herself that same night. The ambulance sirens wailing through our quiet streets at 2 a.m. will haunt me forever. Everyone in town could hear them, and we all knew what had happened. The letters had finally drawn blood, and the mysterious writer had gotten exactly what they seemed to want: complete chaos. The aftermath was devastating. Mr. Nelson was charged with attempted murder and assault with a deadly weapon. Chloe was sent to live with relatives in another state, while she recovered from her suicide attempt. The injured man's wife filed for divorce, and their 3 children had to endure whispers and stares everywhere they went. But the worst part was that the letters didn't stop. If anything, they became more frequent and more vicious. The next wave targeted the families of people who had been trying to investigate the mystery. Police Chief McQuaid received a letter detailing how he'd been taking bribes from local businesses to overlook health code violations. The letter included copies of checks, photographs of him accepting envelopes, and testimonies from business owners who admitted they'd been paying him for years. When the state police arrived to investigate, they found evidence exactly where the letter said it would be, hidden in a false bottom of his desk drawer. McQuaid was arrested within hours, leaving our town without effective law enforcement just when we needed it most. The paranoia reached a breaking point when families started receiving letters about each other's attempts to solve the mystery. The Whitman family got a letter revealing that their neighbor, Mr. Torres, had been secretly recording their phone conversations using equipment he'd ordered from a spy catalog. Mr. Torres received a letter exposing how the Whitmans had been going through his trash every night, looking for clues about who might be writing the letters. It was like the mystery writer could see everything, hear everything, and knew exactly how to turn the entire community against itself. People stopped talking to their neighbors, started changing their locks, and began sleeping with weapons by their bedside. The local hardware store sold out of security cameras, deadbolts, and motion sensors within a week. But somehow, The letters kept finding their way into mailboxes, no matter how many precautions people took. The writer seemed to anticipate every security measure and adapt accordingly. Several families tried sleeping in shifts to watch their mailboxes, but they'd wake up to find letters that had been delivered during the few minutes when they'd dozed off. By late 1984, nearly half the town's population had moved away. The local school had to combine several grades because so many families had fled. Businesses closed because there weren't enough customers left, and the remaining residents lived in a state of constant fear and suspicion. The letters had evolved too. They were no longer just exposing old secrets, but began predicting future actions. The Grimm family received a letter warning them that their son would be caught stealing from the grocery store on a specific date and time. Sure enough, when that date arrived, their son was discovered shoplifting exactly as the letter had predicted. The Cooper family was told their teenage daughter would be found drinking alcohol behind the church on a particular Sunday afternoon. She was caught red-handed at the precise time mentioned in the letter. It was as if the writer wasn't just observing the town's secrets but was somehow orchestrating events, manipulating people into fulfilling the predictions. The psychological pressure was unbearable. People started questioning whether they were making their own choices or being controlled by someone who seemed to know their every thought and action. The end came suddenly in March 1987, exactly 5 years after the first letter. I was 15 by then, and my family was among the few who had stayed in Asheville. Thomas had been promoted to mine supervisor, and Mom had become the interim postmaster after her predecessor fled town. We'd received our own letter the previous month, one that detailed how Thomas had been falsifying safety reports at the mine to meet production quotas. The letter was accurate, of course, and Thomas had confessed everything to Mom and the mine owners. He'd been taking shortcuts that could have gotten people killed, all because he was desperate to keep his job and support our family. The confession destroyed something between my parents, a trust that never fully recovered. But that final morning, something changed. Mom was sorting through the mail when she found an envelope addressed to the entire town. Inside was a single sheet of paper with just one line. "The truth has been served. My work here is complete." That was it. No signature, no explanation, just that simple goodbye message. After that day, the letters stopped completely. No more revelations, no more secrets, no more predictions. The mysterious writer vanished as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving behind a town that was forever changed. Some families tried to rebuild their relationships, but the damage was too deep. Others simply accepted that their secrets were now public knowledge and tried to move forward. A few, like the Nelsons, never recovered from the trauma. Over the years, I've wondered if the letter writer was someone who lived among us the whole time, watching our daily lives and taking notes. Or maybe it was someone from outside who had connections throughout the community, a former resident who had kept in touch with the right people. The truth is, we never found out who was behind it all. The letters stopped, the chaos eventually died down, and life slowly returned to something resembling normal. But Asheville was never the same. The population never recovered, most of the businesses never reopened, and the sense of community trust was permanently broken. I moved away for college in 1990 and rarely go back, but when I do, I can still see the lingering effects of those 5 years. People still seem wary of each other, still reluctant to share personal information, still checking their mailboxes with a mixture of hope and dread. Back in the late 90s, I was living in Brookhaven, Nebraska, a quiet, slow-moving town where everyone knew everyone, or at least thought they did. At the time, I worked part-time at a small local hardware store and spent most of my mornings taking care of my Uncle Frank, who'd been staying with me after a hip surgery. He was in his 70s, still sharp, still stubborn, and swore he didn't need help, but deep down, I think he liked the company. Most of our errands were routine. Grocery store runs, post office visits, and a weekly stop at Whitlow's pharmacy to pick up his vitamins and blood pressure meds. That place had been around forever. People trusted it like they trusted their own churches. The first death didn't raise many eyebrows. Mrs. Ellen Wade, a soft-spoken widow who ran the knitting club at the community center, was found in her recliner one morning by her son. No signs of distress, no struggle, just gone. A heart attack, people guessed. She was old, lived alone, and had some medical issues. But then, only a few days later, Mr. Grant Holloway, who'd just seen his grandkids over the weekend, was also found dead in his bed, almost the same way. No pain, no warning. That's when folks started murmuring. 2 healthy seniors just passing in their sleep within the same week? It didn't sit right. Uncle Frank noticed it first. His vitamins tasted different. Not bitter or spoiled exactly, just wrong. He joked about it, said it reminded him of the stuff he used to clean his fishing gear with. I brushed it off at first, assuming it was just a new brand or a bad batch, until I spotted a tiny burn-like mark on the inside of one of his pill bottles, right where the cap twisted on. It looked like a melted bubble, like the plastic had reacted to something. I thought about tossing the bottle, but something in my gut told me to keep it. Frank started feeling nauseous in the mornings after taking them, and by the 4th day he was pale and weak. We stopped the pills immediately, thinking maybe he'd developed a sensitivity. We didn't realize we were getting dangerously close to something way bigger than a bad batch. I took the bottle back to Whitlow's and asked to speak with someone about it. The guy at the counter, Jeremy, barely looked at it, just said sometimes the heat sealers malfunction, nothing to worry about. But he wouldn't let me keep the bottle, said they'd need it for inventory. I pushed a bit, asked if anyone else had complained. He froze, not obviously, but I caught the flicker. That tiny pause where someone's brain scrambles to come up with the safest lie. That night I checked with some neighbors. Turns out both Ellen and Mr. Holloway had their prescriptions filled at Whitlow's. Same brand of vitamins, same white pill bottle with the yellow sticker. I felt this cold, creeping sense that we'd been inches from something no one was ready to say out loud. The more I dug, the more patterns started forming. Ellen's son mentioned she'd recently increased her vitamin dosage, following advice from someone at the pharmacy. Mr. Holloway's daughter told me he'd switched brands 2 months before. Again, suggested by someone from Whitlow's. All of them had been buying the same specific line of premium senior vitality supplements the pharmacy started carrying that summer. I wasn't trying to play detective at first, I swear, but it felt like nobody else was going to ask these questions. Not the coroner, not the local paper. Everyone was just nodding along like this was all coincidence and bad luck. But people weren't just dropping dead in their sleep by chance. Not here. Not like this. Uncle Frank started getting better after we stopped the pills. He got his color back, started joking again, and insisted on mowing part of the lawn even though he was still limping. I kept that original pill bottle hidden under the sink in a zip bag just in case. A couple weeks later, a local reporter named Dana Bricks showed up at the store. She was chasing rumors about a spike in elderly deaths. I didn't tell her everything, but I mentioned what I'd noticed, and that was enough for her to start sniffing around. It didn't take long before she connected even more dots. Turns out there had been 6 similar deaths since spring, all quiet, all seniors, all from different parts of town but tied together by one thing: Whitlow's pharmacy. Things escalated fast after Dana published the article. At first, it was brushed off like tabloid stuff, but then one of the families demanded an independent toxicology report. What they found was horrifying. Traces of a compound similar to cyanide, but lab-altered, and in such low doses that it would have gone undetected in standard tests. Someone was microdosing poison into those vitamins, enough to shut down an old heart, but subtle enough to mimic natural causes. That's when the cops got involved, and the town's trust started crumbling fast. Whitlow's closed its doors the same day the story broke. The shock came when they arrested Mr. Carlton, the pharmacist. I'd known him since I was a kid. He was the kind of man who remembered birthdays, handed out free lollipops to kids, and sponsored local baseball teams. Everyone liked him. Turns out, beneath the white coat and warm smiles, he was drowning in debt, gambling, bad investments, and rumors of a second family in another state. The insurance policies tied to those seniors. He'd quietly convinced several of them to sign over power of attorney, or had access through family members who trusted him with their elderly parents' meds. It wasn't just sick, it was surgical, cold, calculated. Uncle Frank was one of the lucky ones. I still think about how close he came to being on that list. The investigators asked us for the remaining pills, and when they tested them, the same compound was found. Frank had unknowingly been taking small doses of poison for nearly 2 weeks. The doctors said, if we hadn't stopped when we did, his heart might not have handled it. That knowledge haunted me for months. I kept replaying all those mornings he said he felt weird or too tired to move. I brushed it off as age. Turns out it was something far darker crawling beneath the surface of our quiet routines. The trial was a circus. Carlton pleaded not guilty at first, but the evidence was airtight. Records showed manipulated inventory logs, tampered batch numbers, and even a personal notebook listing dosages tied to specific client names. That image, pages filled with names of real people, neighbors, friends, lined up like a checklist. I don't think I'll ever forget that. It wasn't just betrayal. It was a kind of evil I didn't think people were capable of. Not in a place like this. Not by someone we all trusted with our lives, quite literally. After all that, Whitlow's never reopened. The building sat boarded up for years until someone finally turned it into a pet grooming place. But no one talks about what it used to be. People in town got quieter, more guarded. It changed how we looked at each other. Frank eventually moved in with my cousin out west. Said he wanted to be closer to grandkids, but I knew part of it was just needing distance from everything that happened. I can't blame him. Every time I pass that corner where the pharmacy used to be, I feel like I'm looking at a stage where something terrible once played out behind a friendly curtain. I still don't understand how someone like Carlton could do what he did and smile through it. That's the part that keeps me up sometimes. Not the poison, not even the deaths, but how easily he lived among us while carrying that secret. He saw us every day, shook our hands, gave advice, and walked back into that little room behind the counter to plan another death. Evil doesn't always look how you think it will. Sometimes it wears a white coat and asks how your weekend was. The whole nightmare started on a rainy Thursday evening in late September 2006. I'm Jason, and at the time I was 28, living in this quiet neighborhood called Magnolia Heights in Oxford, Mississippi. My wife Angela and I had bought our first house there about 3 years earlier, a modest 2-story colonial with a big oak tree in the front yard and a wraparound porch that made us feel like we'd finally made it as adults. I was managing construction projects for a local company. Angela worked at the town library, and we were the kind of couple who actually enjoyed mowing the lawn on weekends and hosting barbecues for our neighbors. Life was predictable in the best possible way. We knew everyone on our street, from old Mr. Vincent who collected vintage cars, to the young family next door with twin toddlers who were constantly escaping their yard. Crime wasn't even on our radar. Hell, I left my truck unlocked half the time, and Angela would leave her purse on the passenger seat when she ran into the grocery store. Everything changed when I came home from work that evening around 7 p.m. As I turned onto our street, I immediately noticed something was wrong. Mrs. Patterson from 3 houses down was standing in her driveway, soaking wet from the rain, gesturing wildly at a police officer who was taking notes. Her garage door was wide open, and I could see boxes and tools scattered all over the concrete floor, like someone had ransacked the place. The cop car's red and blue lights were reflecting off the wet pavement, creating this eerie strobe effect that made the whole scene feel surreal. As I pulled into my driveway, Mrs. Patterson caught sight of me and came rushing over, her gray hair plastered to her head and her eyes wild with panic. "Jason, thank God you're here," she said, gripping my arm with both hands. "Someone broke into my garage in broad daylight. Took my husband's toolbox, the leaf blower, even the Christmas decorations from the back corner." The desperation in her voice was something I'd never heard before. This was a woman who usually complained about dandelions in her lawn, not someone who'd been violated in her own home. The officer, a young guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, finished up his report and told Mrs. Patterson he'd file it with the others. Others? That's when I learned this was the 5th break-in on our street in the past 2 weeks. The Hendersons had their shed cleaned out, the Garcias lost their lawn equipment, and apparently someone had even broken into the Miller's house while they were at church on Sunday, making off with jewelry and electronics. The cop mentioned they had no leads, no witnesses, and frankly, limited resources to investigate what seemed like random property crimes. After he left, Mrs. Patterson and I stood there in the drizzle, both of us realizing our little bubble of safety had been completely shattered. She kept talking about how violated she felt, how she'd never sleep well again knowing someone had been in her space, touching her things. I tried to comfort her, but honestly, I was starting to feel pretty uneasy myself. When I got inside, Angela was already making dinner, humming along to the radio like nothing had happened. But when I told her about the break-ins, I watched her face change from carefree to genuinely worried in about 2 seconds. The next morning, I found a handwritten note in my mailbox that would change everything. It was from someone named Captain Mitchell Broussard, a recently retired sheriff who'd moved to our neighborhood about 6 months earlier. I'd seen him around, tall, silver-haired guy with the kind of commanding presence that made you automatically respect him. The note was written in neat, precise handwriting and explained that he'd been monitoring the situation with the recent break-ins and wanted to organize a neighborhood watch group. He was inviting everyone on our street to a meeting at his house that Saturday evening to discuss security measures and coordinate our response to what he called this escalating criminal activity. The way he wrote made it sound official and urgent, like we were dealing with something much more serious than some opportunistic thieves. There was something about his tone that made me feel like finally someone with real experience was taking charge of the situation. Angela read the note over my shoulder and immediately said we should go. She'd been jumpy ever since I told her about the break-ins, double-checking the locks and asking me to walk her to her car when she left for work. The idea of having a retired law enforcement officer organizing our neighborhood's response felt like exactly what we needed. Saturday evening came, and nearly every house on our street was represented at Captain Broussard's meeting. His house was immaculate, the kind of place where every book on the shelf was perfectly aligned, and you could probably eat off the garage floor. He'd set up folding chairs in his living room, had coffee and store-bought cookies laid out, and even prepared a small presentation with charts showing the locations and times of each break-in. The guy was thorough, I'll give him that. He stood at the front of the room in his crisp button-down shirt and spoke with the kind of authority that came from decades of law enforcement experience. "Folks, what we're dealing with here isn't random," he said, pointing to his hand-drawn map of our neighborhood. "These crimes show a pattern. Someone who knows our routines, who understands when houses are empty, who's been watching us." The way he said, "watching us," sent a chill through the room. Mrs. Patterson nodded vigorously, and I could see other neighbors exchanging worried glances. Captain Broussard explained that the police were understaffed and overwhelmed, but that we could take proactive steps to protect ourselves and each other. His plan was comprehensive and, honestly, impressive. He suggested we create a phone tree for immediate communication, establish regular patrol schedules where volunteers would walk the neighborhood at different times, and most importantly, share our daily routines with each other so we'd know when someone should be home versus when their house would be empty. He even proposed installing additional security lights and suggested we all invest in better locks and security systems. The retired captain volunteered to coordinate everything, saying his experience made him the logical choice to lead our efforts. He handed out sheets where we could write down our work schedules, when we typically went grocery shopping, our usual church times, and any upcoming vacations or trips. The more we know about each other's movements, the better we can spot suspicious activity, he explained. It all made perfect sense, and by the end of the meeting, everyone was signed up to participate. Angela squeezed my hand as we walked home, saying she finally felt like we were doing something concrete to protect ourselves. Captain Broussard had given us hope that we could take back control of our neighborhood. And for the first time since the break-ins started, I actually slept well that night. The Neighborhood Watch program launched the following week, and initially it seemed to be working perfectly. Captain Broussard was incredibly organized. He created laminated cards with everyone's contact information, established specific patrol routes, and even set up a communication system using walkie-talkies he'd somehow acquired. Every morning he'd email the group with updates about any suspicious activity reported overnight, weather conditions that might affect our patrols, and reminders about upcoming schedule changes. The man was a machine when it came to organization. He knew when Mrs. Patterson went to her doctor appointments, when the Garcias worked late shifts, and when Mr. Vincent would be out of town visiting his daughter. He kept detailed logs of everything, which he said was crucial for identifying patterns and potential security gaps. The crazy part was that the break-ins completely stopped after we started the program. For 3 weeks, our neighborhood was quieter and safer than it had been in months. People were actually thanking Captain Broussard in the grocery store, and there was talk of expanding the program to include the streets adjacent to ours. Angela was sleeping better. I'd stopped checking the locks obsessively. And honestly, we all felt like we'd found the perfect solution to our problem. But then weird things started happening that didn't quite make sense. I was on patrol duty one evening around 9 p.m. when I noticed Captain Broussard's house was completely dark, which was unusual because he'd mentioned during that morning's email that he'd be home working on watch schedules. His car was in the driveway, but every window was black, and there was no glow from a television or computer screen. I figured maybe he'd gone to bed early, but something nagged at me about it. The next morning, he sent his usual update email, mentioning he'd spent the previous evening reviewing patrol logs and working on security improvements. When I casually mentioned during a conversation later that week that I'd noticed his house was dark during my patrol, he got this strange look on his face, just for a split second, before laughing it off and saying he'd probably been in his basement office with the blinds closed. It was such a minor thing, but it stuck with me because Captain Broussard was usually so precise about everything, and his explanations seemed almost rehearsed. Then Angela mentioned that she'd seen him at the grocery store on a day when he'd specifically told the group he'd be out of town visiting his sister. When she waved at him from across the parking lot, he seemed to quickly get in his car and drive away without acknowledging her, which was totally out of character for someone who usually went out of his way to chat with neighbors. The first real red flag came about a month into the program. I was getting home late from a job site, probably around 10:30 p.m., when I saw Captain Broussard walking down our street wearing all black clothes and carrying what looked like a small duffel bag. He was moving with purpose, not doing a casual patrol, and he was heading away from his house toward the end of our street where the newer families lived. The weird part was that according to our patrol schedule, he wasn't supposed to be on duty that night, and he'd never mentioned anything about doing additional solo patrols. I watched him from my truck for a few minutes, trying to figure out what he was doing, but he disappeared between 2 houses and I lost sight of him. The next morning, there was no mention of any late-night patrol activity in his usual email update, which was strange because he documented everything down to the smallest detail. When I brought it up during our weekly meeting, asking if we should coordinate late-night patrols better, he quickly dismissed it, saying he'd just been unable to sleep and decided to do a quick walk around the block. But his tone was defensive in a way I'd never heard before, and he immediately changed the subject to discussing new security light installations. A couple of other neighbors exchanged glances, and I could tell I wasn't the only one who thought his explanation sounded off. Then the break-ins started up again, but this time they were different, more targeted, more professional. The Hendersons got hit while they were at their daughter's wedding, an event that Captain Broussard definitely knew about because Mrs. Henderson had mentioned it during our last meeting and asked if someone could keep an extra eye on their house. The thieves knew exactly where to look for valuables, bypassing obvious items like the television, and instead taking jewelry from a hidden drawer in the bedroom and cash from a coffee can in the kitchen pantry. When the police investigated, they found no signs of forced entry, which meant whoever did it either had a key or was skilled enough to pick locks without leaving evidence. The timing was perfect, too. The thieves struck during the exact window when the Hendersons were guaranteed to be away, almost like they'd had access to the detailed schedule information Captain Broussard had been collecting from all of us. During the emergency neighborhood meeting he called after the Henderson break-in, I watched his face carefully as he expressed outrage and concern about the escalating situation. He was saying all the right things, but there was something performative about his anger, like he was putting on a show rather than genuinely feeling violated on behalf of our neighbors. The way he kept pushing for more detailed schedule information from everyone, claiming we needed to be even more thorough about tracking our movements, started to feel less like security and more like surveillance. The truth came crashing down on a cold February morning when I was running late for work and forgot my lunch on the kitchen counter. I'd made it about halfway to the job site when I realized and had to turn around. As I pulled back onto our street, I saw Captain Broussard's car parked in the Vincentis' driveway, and I knew for a fact they were supposed to be in Atlanta visiting their son because he'd specifically mentioned it during our last phone tree check-in. My heart started pounding as I parked a few houses down and watched through my windshield. Captain Broussard was walking casually from their backyard toward his car, carrying a small bag and acting like he belonged there. When he saw my truck, he waved cheerfully and approached my window with that same confident smile he always wore during our meetings. "Just doing a security check on the Vincenti place," he said, but his explanation felt hollow and rushed. "Making sure everything looks secure while they're out of town." The way he kept glancing back at their house and the nervous energy radiating from him told a completely different story. I nodded and smiled, but as soon as he drove away, I called the police from my cell phone. The officer who responded found clear evidence of break-in tools in Captain Broussard's car during the traffic stop, along with items that had been reported stolen from various neighborhood break-ins over the past several months. The whole sick scheme unraveled within hours. Captain Broussard had been using our neighborhood watch as the perfect cover for his crimes, exploiting our trust and the detailed information we'd voluntarily given him about our schedules and security vulnerabilities. He'd studied our routines with the precision of a professional investigator, then used his law enforcement background to execute break-ins that left minimal evidence. The police found a detailed notebook in his house containing maps of every home on our street, lists of our work schedules, vacation plans, and even notes about where people kept spare keys or which windows might be easier to access. He'd been the fox guarding the henhouse, and we'd handed him everything he needed to rob us blind. The scariest part was how methodical he'd been. The early break-ins before he organized the watch group were just reconnaissance missions to establish a pattern of crime that would justify his neighborhood security efforts. Once he had our complete trust and detailed information about our lives, he could strike with surgical precision, knowing exactly when homes would be empty and what was worth stealing. During his confession, he admitted to orchestrating 8 different break-ins over a 4-month period, using our own fear and desire for safety as the perfect cover for his operation. The neighborhood watch disbanded immediately, and though he was eventually sentenced to 5 years in prison, the sense of violation went way deeper than just the stolen items. He'd weaponized our community spirit and turned our desire to protect each other into the very thing that made us vulnerable. Mercer, Oklahoma in 1995 was the kind of place where folks still measured time by harvest seasons and church bells. I was 24 that summer, fresh out of college with a teaching degree, and had just moved back home to help my aging parents run our small hardware store on Main Street. The town had maybe 800 people on a good day, the kind of place where everyone waved at each other and left their doors unlocked. My dad always said Mercer was God's country, untouched by the chaos of big cities, and I believed him. We had clean air, honest work, and the purest well water anyone could ask for. Crystal clear and ice cold, pumped straight from the aquifer that ran beneath our red dirt roads. Never once did we question what we were drinking. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came on a scorching hot Wednesday morning in July. I was opening up the store when Mrs. Abernathy from the farmhouse 3 miles out came stumbling through our front door, her face pale as milk, and her usual bright floral dress stained with what appeared to be vomit. She was clutching her stomach with both arms, doubled over in obvious pain, and when she tried to speak, her voice came out as barely a whisper. "Something's wrong with the water," she managed to gasp between dry heaves. "Harold's in the hospital. The baby, too." The way she said it, with such raw terror in her eyes, made my chest tighten. Mrs. Abernathy was tough as nails. I'd seen her wrangle cattle and fix fence posts in thunderstorms. But now she looked like she'd seen death itself. Within hours, the phone at our store wouldn't stop ringing. Families from all over the county were calling, desperate for answers, reporting the same horrific symptoms. The Petersons had rushed their twin daughters to the emergency room after they started vomiting blood. Old Mr. Fitzgerald collapsed on his porch and was found by his mailman, convulsing and frothing at the mouth. The Crawfords' livestock were dropping dead in their pastures, and their youngest son was having seizures. Every single call painted the same nightmarish picture: people drinking their morning coffee or giving their children a glass of water, then falling violently ill within hours. The hospital in the next town over was overwhelmed, with families driving in from every direction, carrying unconscious relatives and screaming children. The strangest part was the pattern. Not everyone in Mercer was getting sick, just certain families, scattered across specific areas of the county. My family was fine, as were the Whites who lived next door and the Kowalskis who ran the diner. But the affected families were all rural, all had their own wells, and all lived in a rough horseshoe shape around the eastern edge of town. I remember staring at the map my dad had pinned to the wall behind our counter, marking each affected household with a red thumbtack. The pattern was too precise to be random, too deliberate to be coincidence. Something was targeting these specific families, and as the day wore on, more red thumbtacks appeared on that map, creating a crimson arc of suffering that made my skin crawl. The state health department arrived by Friday, a convoy of white vans and officials in hazmat suits who turned our quiet town into what felt like a disaster zone. They started testing everything: soil samples, water from every well, even the air we breathed. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, the lead investigator, set up a makeshift command center in our high school gymnasium, and I volunteered to help coordinate with the local families. She was a sharp woman with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, and when she pulled me aside that evening, her expression was grave. "We've found industrial chemicals in the affected wells," she said quietly. "Trichloroethylene, benzene, heavy metals, stuff that shouldn't exist anywhere near a residential area. This isn't an accident or natural contamination. Someone is deliberately poisoning these people." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Someone in our community, someone we knew, someone we trusted, was systematically poisoning their neighbors. Dr. Hartwell explained that the chemicals were expensive industrial solvents, the kind used in manufacturing and metalworking, not something you'd find lying around a farm or small town. Whoever was doing this had access to dangerous materials and knew exactly what they were doing. The thought that one of our own could be capable of such calculated evil made me question everything I thought I knew about the people I'd grown up with. That night I couldn't sleep, staring at the ceiling and wondering if I'd unknowingly shaken hands with a monster, if I'd made small talk with someone who was slowly murdering children. The investigation took a disturbing turn when Dr. Hartwell's team discovered that the contamination wasn't random. It was surgical. Each affected well had been deliberately accessed, with tiny holes drilled near the wellheads and carefully concealed. The perpetrator had used a specialized drill bit, the kind used for precision work, and had somehow managed to inject the chemicals directly into the water supply without leaving obvious traces. This wasn't the work of some deranged amateur. This was planned, methodical, and executed with frightening expertise. The FBI was called in, and suddenly our little town was crawling with federal agents asking questions about everyone and everything. They set up surveillance equipment, conducted interviews, and started building profiles of every resident who might have the knowledge and means to carry out such an attack. What made it even more terrifying was the timeline. The contamination had been happening for weeks, maybe months, before anyone got sick enough to notice. The chemicals were being introduced in small doses, building up in people's systems gradually until they reached toxic levels. Some of the victims, particularly the elderly and children, were showing signs of permanent organ damage. Little Amy Peterson, who was only 7, had developed kidney problems that doctors said might never fully heal. The monster doing this wasn't just trying to make people sick. They were slowly, methodically destroying lives, families, and futures. The calculated cruelty of it all was almost impossible to comprehend, and I found myself studying the faces of everyone I met, wondering if they could be capable of such inhuman behavior. The breakthrough came on a rainy Monday morning when Agent Rebecca Stone knocked on our store door before we'd even opened. She was a compact woman with intense green eyes and a no-nonsense attitude that reminded me of my high school principal. "We need to talk about land ownership in this area," she said, spreading out a detailed survey map on our counter. "All the affected properties have something in common. They're all sitting on prime grazing land that borders the Whitmore Ranch." The name hit me like a punch to the gut. Caleb Whitmore was one of the most respected men in the county, a third-generation rancher who owned over 2,000 acres of the best cattle land in eastern Oklahoma. He was a pillar of the community, served on the school board, and donated generously to the church. The idea that he could be behind this seemed absolutely impossible. But as Agent Stone laid out the evidence, a horrifying picture began to emerge. For the past 2 years, Whitmore had been quietly trying to buy up all the properties surrounding his ranch, making lowball offers that most families had rejected. The affected wells were all on properties he'd tried to purchase, and the contamination pattern perfectly matched the boundaries of the land he wanted to acquire. "He's been systematically poisoning his neighbors to force them off their properties," Agent Stone explained, her voice cold with disgust. "Once they're desperate enough, he swoops in with cash offers for their worthless, contaminated land. It's one of the most calculated real estate schemes we've ever seen." The realization that someone could orchestrate such elaborate suffering just to expand their business empire made me physically ill. This wasn't just about money. It was about a complete lack of human conscience. The arrest happened that very afternoon, and I'll never forget the scene. FBI agents surrounded Whitmore's ranch house while he was having lunch with his family, as if he were just another ordinary Tuesday. When they led him out in handcuffs, he looked genuinely confused, playing the part of an innocent man being wrongfully accused. But they'd found everything. Barrels of industrial chemicals hidden in an old barn, drilling equipment with traces of the contaminated soil, and most damning of all, a detailed map showing exactly which wells he'd targeted and when. They also discovered he'd been purchasing the chemicals through a fake company he'd set up in Texas, using false documentation and paying in cash. The man who'd sat next to me at church every Sunday for 20 years had been living a double life as a calculated poisoner. What haunts me most is how easily he fooled all of us. Even after his arrest, when the evidence was overwhelming, part of me struggled to believe it was true. Whitmore had been the guy who helped neighbors fix their tractors, who brought casseroles to families when someone died, who coached Little League and organized the annual charity drive. The FBI found records showing he'd been planning this scheme for over 3 years, studying property values, researching the health effects of different chemicals, and carefully timing his attacks to maximize suffering while minimizing suspicion. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole, and every single affected family received substantial compensation. But the damage was done. Several people never fully recovered, and our community never felt the same. Trust, once broken on such a fundamental level, leaves scars that never completely heal. Even now, almost 30 years later, I still test my water regularly, and I still wonder about the people I thought I knew. Pine Valley, Idaho has always been the kind of town where secrets don't stay buried long. Everyone waves at each other from their pickup trucks, and the biggest excitement usually comes from arguing about which brand of fertilizer works best on corn. I became a registered nurse at Pine Valley Community Clinic in 2018, fresh out of nursing school and eager to help my neighbors. The clinic sat right on Main Street in this old brick building that Dr. Martinez had been running since the Carter administration. Most days we treated everything from scraped knees to high blood pressure, and the elderly folks in town treated us like family. Mrs. Rodriguez would bring us homemade cookies every Thursday, and old Mr. Stevens always asked about my mom's garden. It felt like the perfect place to build a career, until October 2023 changed everything I thought I knew about healing people. The trouble started with Diane Walsh, our head medical assistant who'd been there for almost 20 years. She was this soft-spoken woman in her 50s, with graying hair always pulled back in a neat bun, and these wire-rimmed glasses that made her look like everyone's favorite librarian. Diane knew every patient's medication history by heart, could draw blood from the most difficult veins, and had this gentle way of talking to scared kids that made them stop crying instantly. Dr. Martinez trusted her completely. She basically ran the day-to-day operations while he focused on diagnoses and treatment plans. All the elderly patients adored her because she'd sit with them during procedures, holding their hands and telling them stories about her grandchildren. If I had to pick the most caring person I'd ever met, Diane would have been at the top of that list, which is why what happened next still gives me nightmares. The first sign that something was wrong came on a Thursday morning in late October. I walked into the clinic around 7 a.m. to prep for our early appointments and found Diane already there, sitting in the break room with her coffee mug clutched between both hands. Her eyes were red-rimmed and puffy, like she'd been crying, and she had this 1,000-yard stare that made my chest tighten. When I asked if she was okay, she just mumbled something about having a rough night and shuffled off to start her morning routine. That wasn't like her at all. Diane was usually the first one to crack jokes and ask about everyone's weekend plans. But lately, she'd been quieter, more withdrawn. I chalked it up to stress from her husband's recent cancer diagnosis, but deep down, something felt different about her energy. She moved through the clinic like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders, and every time she thought no one was watching, her face would crumple into this expression of pure exhaustion. The real alarm bells started ringing when we lost 3 elderly patients in just 2 weeks. Now, Pine Valley had its share of folks in their 80s and 90s, so death wasn't exactly unusual, but these cases were different. Each one had been relatively stable when they came in for routine checkups, and each one passed away peacefully in their sleep within 48 hours of visiting our clinic. Mr. Grayson, who'd been managing his diabetes just fine, died on a Monday night. Mrs. Chen, who came in complaining about joint pain, passed away Wednesday evening. Then there was old Pete Murphy, who'd been joking about outliving his third wife just days before he died quietly in his recliner. Their families were devastated, but grateful that their loved ones hadn't suffered. They all described the same thing. Their family members had seemed unusually calm and sleepy after their appointments, then simply never woke up the next morning. Dr. Martinez kept saying it was just one of those sad coincidences, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. What made everything worse was watching Diane's behavior become increasingly erratic. She'd started volunteering to handle all the medication preparations for our elderly patients, insisting that she wanted to take some burden off everyone else. During appointments, she'd disappear into the supply closet for unusually long periods, and when she emerged, she'd have this strange, almost serene expression on her face. I noticed she'd begun staying late after we closed, claiming she needed to organize patient files. But whenever I offered to help, she'd quickly decline and practically push me toward the door. The most unsettling part was how she'd started talking about our elderly patients differently. Instead of her usual warm, grandmotherly concern, she'd make these odd comments about how tired they looked, or how they seemed to be suffering more than they let on. When I mentioned that Mrs. Jen had seemed pretty cheerful during her last visit. Diane just shook her head and said something about people hiding their pain to protect their families. Her whole demeanor had shifted from nurturing to something that felt almost predatory, though I couldn't put my finger on why. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon when I accidentally walked in on Diane preparing medications in the supply room. She was hunched over a small glass vial, using a syringe to draw up what looked like a clear liquid. Definitely not any of the standard medications we typically administered. When she heard me come in, she jumped like she'd been electrocuted and quickly shoved the vial into her pocket. Her face went completely white, and she started stammering about needing to double-check dosages for Mr. Williamson's blood pressure medication. But here's the thing. Mr. Williamson was scheduled for a routine physical, not any kind of injection or IV treatment. I asked her directly what was in the vial, and she gave me this long, rambling explanation about preparing emergency medications, just in case, but her voice was shaking and she wouldn't make eye contact. After she left the room, I checked our medication inventory and found that we were missing several vials of midazolam, a powerful sedative that, in high doses, could easily stop someone's breathing. That's when the horrible truth started clicking into place, and I realized I might be working alongside a killer. I spent the entire weekend in a panic, trying to figure out what to do with this information. Part of me wanted to believe I was jumping to conclusions. After all, this was Diane, the woman who'd taught me how to properly comfort grieving families and who still sent birthday cards to former patients. But the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. I started going through our recent patient files, cross-referencing the elderly patients who died with their appointment times, and discovered a chilling pattern. Every single one of them had been scheduled for late afternoon appointments when most of the staff had already gone home, leaving just Diane and Dr. Martinez in the building. More disturbing was the fact that all of these patients had received vitamin B12 injections, according to their charts, something that wasn't part of their usual treatment plans. When I called their families to offer condolences, several mentioned that their loved ones had seemed unusually drowsy and peaceful after their appointments, describing them as ready to go and at peace with everything. The picture that emerged was absolutely terrifying. Diane had been systematically identifying patients she believed were suffering, then administering lethal doses of sedatives under the guise of routine care. The confrontation happened on Monday morning when I couldn't stand the weight of my suspicions anymore. I arrived early and found Diane already preparing for the day, methodically laying out supplies with that same eerie calm she'd been displaying for weeks. I told her I knew what she'd been doing, and instead of denying it or acting shocked, she just sat down heavily in her chair and started crying. Through her tears, she confessed everything, how she'd been watching these elderly patients struggle with pain and illness, how their families seemed so exhausted from caregiving, and how she'd convinced herself that she was performing acts of mercy. She kept repeating that she was helping them find peace, and that she couldn't bear to watch them suffer anymore. The most chilling part was when she described the process, how she'd wait until Dr. Martinez was busy with other patients, then administer the midazolam injections while holding their hands and whispering that everything would be okay. She genuinely believed she was being compassionate, and the complete disconnect between her intentions and her actions made my skin crawl. Here was someone I'd trusted completely, someone who'd taught me about patient care, and she'd been playing God with people's lives while convincing herself she was saving them. What happened next was the hardest thing I've ever had to do in my entire life. I told Diane that I had to report what she'd confessed, and she just nodded like she'd been expecting it. She didn't beg me to keep quiet or try to justify her actions further. She just sat there looking utterly defeated, like all the fight had drained out of her. When I called the police, my voice was shaking so badly that the dispatcher had to ask me to repeat myself 3 times. Within an hour, our quiet little clinic was swarming with investigators, and Diane was being led away in handcuffs while news crews gathered outside. The whole thing felt surreal. Just that morning, she'd been preparing to help patients, and by noon she was being charged with multiple counts of murder. Dr. Martinez was absolutely devastated when he found out. He kept saying he should have noticed something. But honestly, Diane had been so careful that even someone paying close attention might have missed the signs. The families of the deceased patients were torn between grief and anger. Some felt betrayed, that their loved ones had been murdered, while others admitted they were almost relieved their family members had died peacefully, instead of suffering through prolonged illness. The investigation revealed that Diane had killed at least 7 elderly patients over the course of 3 months, all with overdoses of midazolam administered during routine appointments. The authorities found detailed notes in her car where she'd written about each patient's suffering and her reasons for helping them transition. Some of the entries were absolutely heartbreaking. She described sitting with terminal cancer patients and feeling overwhelmed by their pain, or watching family members struggle with the emotional and financial burden of caring for aging relatives. In her twisted logic, she thought she was providing a service that the medical system couldn't offer, ending suffering before it became unbearable. The most disturbing part was how methodical she'd been. She'd researched the exact dosages needed to cause respiratory failure, timed her injections to coincide with busy periods when Dr. Martinez was distracted, and even practiced her explanations for why patients seemed sleepy after their appointments. She'd turned mercy killing into a carefully planned operation, all while maintaining the facade of being the clinic's most compassionate caregiver. The trial lasted 6 months, and I had to testify about what I'd witnessed and how I'd discovered the missing medications. Diane pleaded guilty to 7 counts of second-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. During her sentencing, she gave this long speech about how she'd been trying to spare families the agony of watching their loved ones deteriorate, and how the medical system had failed these patients by keeping them alive when they were ready to die. Even then, she maintained that her actions had been motivated by compassion rather than malice. The judge wasn't buying it. He called her a predator who'd exploited the trust of vulnerable patients and their families, and said that her delusions of mercy didn't excuse the fact that she'd committed cold-blooded murder. Watching her get sentenced was simultaneously satisfying and heartbreaking, because I could see glimpses of the woman who'd been my mentor, the one who'd taught me to always put patients first. It was like watching 2 completely different people occupy the same body, and I still struggle to reconcile the caring colleague I'd known with the killer she'd become. The Pine Valley Community Clinic never reopened after the scandal. Dr. Martinez retired immediately, saying he couldn't trust himself to properly supervise staff after missing such obvious warning signs. The building sits empty now, with a for sale sign that's been there for over a year. Most of our elderly patients had to drive 40 minutes to the next town for medical care, and several families moved away entirely because they couldn't handle the constant reminders of what had happened. I transferred to a hospital in Boise, but I still have nightmares about finding those missing medication vials and wondering how many other patients might have died if I hadn't discovered Diane's secret. The hardest part is that I understand on some level what drove her to do it. Watching people suffer is brutal, and the desire to help them find peace is natural for anyone in healthcare. But there's a line between compassion and murder, and Diane crossed it 7 times while convincing herself she was doing the right thing. I'll never forget the look on her face when she confessed, that mixture of guilt and self-righteousness that made me realize how dangerous good intentions can become when they're not tempered by respect for human life and choice. The summer of 1993 in Milford changed everything about how I see the world. At 28, I was living what most people would call a simple life, shift supervisor at the local cheese processing plant, making sure our small town's pride and joy kept churning out those wheels of cheddar that made us famous across Wisconsin. Every morning at 5 a.m., I'd wake up in my little rental house on Elm Street, work until 3 p.m., then come home to tinker with my motorcycle in the garage or read whatever paperback I'd picked up from the library. Milford was one of those places where everyone knew everyone else's business, where the biggest excitement was usually the county fair, or when someone's livestock got loose. The most scandalous thing that had happened in years was when Mrs. Thornton's chickens somehow ended up in the church basement during Bible study. That's the kind of predictable, quiet existence I thought I'd signed up for when I left Milwaukee behind. The whole thing started on a Wednesday morning in late June. The air still held that perfect summer coolness, smelling like fresh-cut grass and wildflowers from the fields surrounding town. I was getting ready for work, had just finished my coffee and was reaching for my keys when I heard the familiar rumble of the mail truck coming down the street. Nothing unusual about that. Our mailman always made his rounds right around 7:30. But when I stepped outside to grab the mail before heading to the plant, there was something different in my box alongside the usual bills and grocery store circulars. A plain manila envelope with no return address, just my name written in block letters across the front. The handwriting was neat, almost mechanical, like someone had taken great care to make sure every letter was perfectly formed. Inside that envelope was a cassette tape, the kind you'd buy at any drugstore with a white label that simply read, "Listen." I almost threw the thing away, figured it was some kind of prank or maybe a local band trying to get their music heard. But curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to pop it into my old boombox when I got home from work that evening. The first few seconds were just static, that familiar hiss you get from cheap recording equipment. Then I heard voices, 2 voices actually, having what sounded like a private conversation. At first I thought maybe someone had accidentally recorded over a blank tape, caught some radio show or TV program. But as I kept listening, the voices became clearer, more distinct. One was a woman's voice, soft and concerned, asking about doctor appointments and medication schedules. The other was an elderly man, his voice shaky and tired, talking about his arthritis acting up and how he'd been having trouble sleeping. The conversation was so mundane, so personal that it felt wrong to be listening. But then the woman said something that made my spine tingle. "Dad, I wish you'd let me move that old radio from your bedroom. It's been acting up lately, making weird noises at night." The tape continued for another 10 minutes, capturing what was obviously a private conversation between a daughter and her elderly father. They talked about grocery shopping, his physical therapy appointments, and whether he needed help with his medication. Normal, everyday stuff that families discuss behind closed doors. But hearing it played back on this anonymous tape felt deeply invasive, like I was eavesdropping on something sacred. The quality was surprisingly good too, not like someone had held a tape recorder up to a window, but crisp and clear, as if the microphone had been right there in the room with them. When the tape finally ended, I sat there staring at the boombox, trying to make sense of what I'd just heard. Who would record such a private conversation? And more importantly, why would they send it to me? I didn't recognize the voices, though something about the woman's tone reminded me of someone I might have met around town. The whole thing left me with an uneasy feeling that I couldn't quite shake, like I'd accidentally stumbled into something I wasn't supposed to know about. The next morning at work, I couldn't concentrate on anything. While checking the production line, my mind kept wandering back to that tape. During my lunch break, I found myself talking to Carl, one of the older guys who'd lived in Milford his whole life. I didn't mention the tape directly, just asked him if he'd heard about anything strange happening around town lately. Carl scratched his graying beard and said that his neighbor, Mrs. Henley, had been acting paranoid recently, claiming someone was watching her house. He also mentioned that the Webbers down on Main Street had been arguing more than usual, loud enough that people walking by could hear them from the sidewalk. At the time, I thought it was just typical small-town gossip, but now I wonder if those arguments were happening because they'd received their own mysterious tapes. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that I wasn't the only one who'd gotten an unwanted delivery. There was something systematic about the whole thing, too organized to be a random prank. That evening, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood, hoping to clear my head and maybe spot something unusual. Milford had always been the kind of place where people left their windows open on summer nights, where you could hear the faint sounds of dinner conversations and television shows drifting from house to house. But as I walked past the familiar homes on Elm Street, I started paying attention to details I'd never noticed before. The Sandersons had a new ceramic garden gnome sitting by their front porch. One of those kitschy things you'd find at a garage sale or flea market. The Mitchells had recently hung a decorative wind chime near their kitchen window, and I could see through the glass that they were having dinner at their small table. Mrs. Carmichael's house had a new wooden birdhouse mounted on her fence post, painted bright blue with yellow trim. All of these were innocent enough decorations, the kind of things people pick up to brighten their yards. But seeing them all together, clustered in the same few blocks, made me realize that a lot of folks had been shopping at the same places recently. The monthly flea market at the community center had been particularly busy this summer, with vendors bringing in all sorts of household items and garden decorations. Friday morning brought another tape. This one was different. Instead of one conversation, it contained fragments of multiple recordings, like someone had spliced together bits and pieces from different homes. I heard a man complaining about his boss while doing dishes, a woman on the phone with her sister discussing her husband's drinking problem, and even what sounded like a couple having an intimate conversation in their bedroom. The audio quality was consistently excellent across all the recordings, with that same crisp clarity that suggested professional equipment. But what really disturbed me was recognizing one of the voices. It was Janet from the post office, talking to someone about her daughter's college tuition payments. I'd stood behind Janet in line at the grocery store just last week, and her distinctive laugh was unmistakable. The realization hit me like a physical blow. These weren't random strangers, these were my neighbors, people I saw every day around town. Someone was systematically recording private conversations in homes throughout Milford, and they were distributing the evidence like some sick form of entertainment. That afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I drove straight to the sheriff's office, clutching both tapes in a paper bag. Sheriff Morrison was a decent guy, someone I'd shared a few beers with at the annual firefighters fundraiser, but when I tried to explain what I'd found, he looked at me like I'd lost my mind. He listened to about 30 seconds of the first tape, then handed it back with a shrug. "Could be anybody, Tom," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Maybe someone's got a police scanner picking up phone conversations. Or maybe it's just actors, people making up stories for some kind of radio show project." I tried to argue that these were real conversations, that I'd recognized Janet's voice, but he wasn't buying it. The sheriff's attitude was frustrating, but not entirely surprising. Milford was the kind of place where serious crimes just didn't happen, where the biggest law enforcement challenge was usually breaking up fights at the tavern on Saturday nights. He promised to look into it if I brought him something more concrete, but I could tell he thought I was wasting his time. Walking out of that office, I realized I was on my own with this mystery. Over the weekend, I started doing my own investigation. I began by visiting the community center where the monthly flea market was held, hoping to find some clues about recent vendors or unusual items that had been sold. The center's volunteer coordinator, an elderly woman named Doris, was surprisingly helpful when I explained that I was looking for information about decorative items and household goods. She pulled out a thick binder filled with vendor registration forms and receipts from the past few months. As we flipped through the pages, one name kept appearing repeatedly: Hartley Electronics and Collectibles. According to the records, this vendor had been selling refurbished radios, decorative items with built-in speakers, novelty clocks, and even some garden ornaments with small weather monitoring devices. The vendor had been particularly active during the past 2 months, always setting up in the same corner spot near the back entrance. Doris remembered him as a quiet, middle-aged man who wore thick glasses and always paid his table fees in cash. He'd told her he was cleaning out his late father's electronics repair shop, selling off old inventory and personal collections. The more I learned about this Hartley character, the more convinced I became that he was behind the tapes. I started making a list of all the homes where I'd noticed new flea market purchases, cross-referencing them with the conversations I'd heard on the recordings. The pattern was becoming clear. Every house that had received items from the flea market seemed to be represented on those tapes. But what really made my skin crawl was the realization that this wasn't random surveillance. It was targeted. Someone had deliberately planted listening devices in household items, knowing that people would bring them into their most private spaces. The ceramic gnomes, the decorative radios, the wind chimes, even the birdhouses, they were all potential hiding spots for tiny microphones. I spent Sunday afternoon walking through my neighborhood again, this time with a notebook, documenting every new decoration or household item I could spot. The evidence was overwhelming. At least 24 homes had purchased items from the flea market in recent months, and I was willing to bet that every single one of those families had received their own anonymous tapes. Monday morning, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I called in sick to work and drove to the addresses listed on Hartley's vendor registration forms. The first address was a rundown house on the outskirts of town, with newspapers piled up on the front porch and mail overflowing from the mailbox, clearly abandoned. The second address led me to a vacant lot where a house had obviously been demolished months earlier. But the third address was different. It was a legitimate electronics repair shop on the other side of the county, about 30 miles from Milford. When I walked in, the owner, an older man named Bob, immediately recognized the name I mentioned. He explained that someone calling himself Hartley had rented storage space in his back room about 4 months ago, paying cash up front for 3 months. The man had claimed he was dealing with an estate sale and needed temporary storage for electronics and collectibles. Bob described him as nervous and secretive, someone who always came by after hours to access his stored items. The storage rental had expired 2 weeks ago, and when the man didn't show up to renew or collect his belongings, Bob had opened the unit to find it completely empty, except for some wire clippings and a few electronics catalogs. Armed with this information, I returned to Milford and did something I'd never done before. I went door to door, talking to neighbors about the mysterious tapes. To my surprise, almost everyone I spoke with had received at least one. The Sandersons had gotten 3 different tapes, all containing recordings of their dinner conversations and phone calls. Mrs. Carmichael had received a tape with her private prayers recorded from her bedroom. The Mitchells had gotten recordings of their arguments about money and their discussions about their son's troubles at school. Once people started opening up, the full scope of the violation became clear. We'd all been living in our homes, thinking we were safe and private, while someone had been systematically recording our most intimate moments. The anger in the neighborhood was palpable, but it was mixed with a deep sense of helplessness. The man called Hartley had vanished, the sheriff wasn't taking us seriously, and we were left with the unsettling knowledge that our private lives had been broadcast to strangers. That evening, about 15 of us met at the community center to figure out what to do next. We decided to systematically check every item purchased from the flea market, and what we found confirmed our worst fears. Tiny microphones hidden in electronic devices, speakers wired to transmit instead of receive, and even some garden decorations with sophisticated recording equipment disguised as weather sensors. We spent the next week removing and destroying every suspicious item we could find, but the damage was already done. The sense of security we'd all taken for granted was gone forever. I was working maintenance for the County Roads Division back then. Nothing thrilling, just long days patching asphalt and clearing brush along the back highways near Lisbon. The kind of job where you knew everyone by name, or at least by truck. That morning, I had clocked in around 6, and by mid-afternoon I was finishing up near County Road 18, close to one of those rest stops no one ever really uses. You know the type. 2 cracked picnic tables, a faded vending machine that probably hadn't worked since the 90s, and a single bathroom that somehow always smelled like mildew and bleach at the same time. I'd driven past it 100 times, never thought twice. That day, though, something felt wrong. Not eerie or dramatic, just off routine. Around 4, I noticed a cruiser parked crooked at the far end of the lot, half in the grass. It was one of ours. Sheriff's Department. At first, I thought maybe the deputy inside had pulled over to take a nap or make a call. But as I passed by in the truck, I realized the driver's side door was hanging open. The lights weren't flashing, but the engine was idling, and the radio was still squawking with dispatch chatter, like someone had just stepped out for a second and never came back. No one else was around. I got out, walked over, called out a couple times, "Hello," and peeked inside. No sign of anyone. The laptop mount was still logged in, a bottle of water in the cup holder, half empty. I recognized the name on the screen, Deputy Lane Kessler, young guy, polite, only been on the force maybe a year or two, but people liked him. The last time I saw him was at the diner off Route 1. He bought a coffee for an old vet who didn't have enough change. That kind of guy. Always waved when he passed. It didn't make sense that he'd leave his car like that. It didn't fit him. I didn't touch anything. I backed up, called the non-emergency number and told them exactly what I saw. While I waited, I kept scanning the tree line. The rest stop backs up against an old cornfield on one side and a cluster of woods on the other, dense with those thick, clawing branches that always seem to block the light, even at noon. I didn't see movement, but the silence felt heavy. Not the peaceful kind, more like the world was holding its breath. Within 20 minutes, 2 patrol units pulled in, followed by an unmarked SUV. That's when everything started spiraling fast. They taped off the area quick. I stood back near my truck while one of the deputies asked me to go over what I saw, how long the car had been there, whether I noticed any other vehicles, people, anything strange. But honestly, it was just empty when I got there. Not even tire tracks that looked fresh besides mine and the cruiser's. The weird part was the passenger door. It had a smudge near the handle, like someone with dirty gloves had touched it. Almost greasy, hard to miss in the sunlight. I mentioned it, but I don't know if they ever found anything off it. They kept circling the area, but it was all just grass, cracked pavement, and trees that didn't talk back. That night, the town Facebook page lit up. Rumors spread fast. Some folks said he got ambushed. Others claimed they saw a white van parked near the rest stop the night before. You know how people get when there are no answers. They fill in the blanks themselves. But one thing stuck out. No one saw him after midnight. His last radio log showed he called in a routine check just before 12:40 a.m. Then nothing. No distress call, no follow-up. Just radio silence until I found the car almost 4 hours later. Whatever happened fast, clean, quiet. Over the next few days, the search ramped up. Helicopters scanned the fields. Dogs were brought in, volunteers combed the woods. I joined the Saturday morning grid search and spent hours walking between rows of corn that reached up to my shoulders. The whole time, it felt like we were looking for someone who wasn't there anymore. Not just missing, gone, like he'd been plucked out of the world and erased. No footprints, no blood, no broken branches. But some of the guys whispered about a clearing deeper in the woods, one that wasn't marked on any of the maps. They said it looked like people had been gathering there. By the time Monday rolled around, the sheriff's department had shifted their tone. It wasn't a missing persons case anymore. They brought in federal agents and we stopped getting updates. But word travels. One of my buddies from county road crew, Brent, said he'd seen trucks pulling off that exit late at night for months. Box trucks, no markings. Never stayed long. Always in and out before dawn. We all thought it was just construction crews or supply runs. Now it looked more like something organized, coordinated. And maybe Deputy Kessler, had caught a glimpse of something he wasn't supposed to. A week after the disappearance, a farmer named Len Harbin found a jacket buried under a pile of brush near the south fence of his property, about 2 miles from the rest stop, not visible from the road. It was standard sheriff's issue, name tag still attached. They never said it publicly, but word was there was blood on the collar. That's when everything locked down even more. Len said unmarked trucks showed up that same afternoon, and by evening, the brush was cleared. The soil was tested and a huge section of his land was marked off. He told me later that they'd found tire impressions leading into a dirt trail he didn't even know existed, like it had been used and covered again. Deputy Kessler's body was never found, not officially. But about a month after everything settled down, I got a message on Facebook from someone I didn't know. No profile picture, no mutual friends. Just a short message. He did the right thing. Don't talk to anyone else about that day. I'll be honest, I didn't sleep that night. I deleted the message, logged off, and didn't bring it up again until now. Maybe I should have gone to someone with it, but part of me figured they already knew. Whoever they are. Eventually, the department held a memorial for him. Full honors. His mom spoke. The whole town showed up, lining Main Street in silence while the cruisers rolled by, lights spinning slowly. I stood near the back and watched, but I couldn't stop thinking about that cruiser sitting there with the door open, like he'd stepped out just for a second. Like he thought whatever he saw wasn't going to be a problem. Whatever operation was happening out there, whether it was trafficking, weapons, something else, it was big enough to make a person disappear without a trace, and quiet enough that most people still don't believe it happened the way it did. I still drive by that rest stop sometimes, usually early mornings on my way out to patch potholes or salt the roads in winter. It looks the same, empty. The vending machine's gone now, just a concrete slab where it used to be. But every time I slow down, I catch myself checking the edge of the trees, the brush beyond the guardrail, half expecting someone to step out. I never stop. Not anymore. Whatever was out there that night, it made sure to clean up after itself. But it left just enough behind for the rest of us to remember and to stay quiet.